Thank you for coming out tonight and welcome to our debate. My name is Ariel Hall. I'm the service coordinator of the University Honors Association. This was part of our service month. We're going to have a debate after our Paya Professor event. This is in support of healthy golf, and we are going to be debating tonight whether or not free market environmentalism is a market failure. And we have our two debaters tonight, Dr. Walter Block and Dr. Craig Hood. Each will be presenting their position for 15 minutes exactly. Dr. Hood will begin. After that, there will be 10 minutes for each to rebut the other's position. And after that, we will have 5 minutes of concludatory remarks from each. And we will have a 30-minute question and answer session where all of you may ask questions to our presenters. So with that said, let's welcome Dr. Hood.
So, welcome everybody, and I want to start just at the very beginning just to give you some context. I came here 33 years ago. I was a brand new assistant professor, didn't have a gray hair on me. Just for context that's sort of important to this, I'm an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, and that is my scholarship is in actually evolutionary biology. So there's one thing that I can think in terms of, which is scale at not just decades, but centuries and even thousands and even hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And that is important, but also soon after I arrived here, I'd never been in a wetland setting. I'd never been to Louisiana or New Orleans. And David White, who's sitting out there, a wetland ecologist here, took me to the Mississippi Delta in about 1988. And then we started collaborating around 1990 on studying roseau cane at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And actually, just the drive down, you get a lot of experiences about what it's like in upper and lower Plaquemines Parish and how it's changed the last 30 years. I have a few little flyers here. Of course, we're an academic place. And there's literally thousands of peer-reviewed published papers about Gulf coastal restoration and about how it's been managed and how it should be paid for, etc., to get us to where. But I think these particular papers are important in lots of different ways. There's obviously been many, many books on the impacts of the Mississippi River, everything from John McPhee all the way to John Berry and others. But anyway, so I'm going to start off at the beginning here, describing something about our coastal landscape because it is a really important piece. We can't just talk theoretically about the economics and social pieces, even though that's, very important. So here's the deal. What's the problem? Gulf coastal ecosystems in Louisiana are in collapse. They are collapsed. They are collapsed. Okay, so we have this collapse, and we're trying to manage it now. We've been trying to manage it for many, many years. And honestly, we're just trying to hold on. We're trying to hold on to what we have to make sure that not only do coastal communities survive, but greater New Orleans survives. There's 1 million people in greater New Orleans. Their survival actually depends on this. And relative to this debate, this is very uncomfortable for me and Professor Block, I'm sure, because there's the ecosystem piece of it. That's my scholarship, I'm comfortable there, right? I have to talk about that, and he has to a little bit, right? There's the economic piece. I'm not an economist, but I have to talk about that the best I can. And there's a social, cultural, political piece, like what's happened. Okay. So here's the nature of the facts of what's going on. It's been very well documented for 20 plus years. We knew it. We knew the basic biophysical collapse. We basically understood it all, I'd say, by late 1980s. We knew what was going on. We live in a deltaic estuarine system that needs to have the Mississippi River delivering sediments. Okay? This whole area down here was developed roughly south of Lake Pontchartrain, at most the last 4,000 years, and actually a lot more recently than that. Basically, we have starved all of this landscape. And we've starved it by leveeing the Mississippi River and creating other hurricane protection levees since 1927, the great 1927 flood that John McPhee, and actually McPhee was talking about the original Eads Jetty way, for commerce. But anyway, and John Barry and many, many others. So that leveeing of the river has starved us and those ecosystems. And the building of canals since about the early 1930s. And one of the papers I mentioned here is by Oliver Houck, who relates in 2015, gives a little summary of oil and gas, canal building, et cetera, but it's been summarized by many, many people for a long time. And the bottom line is, starting in the 1930s, there were all these canals dredged everywhere to try and develop oil, but quite honestly, oil and gas wasn't really available in those wetlands, so actually, all the damage was done through about 1960. Maybe 1970 at the latest. Most of the damage of the canal building that allowed salt water in and all sorts of other things. And in addition to that, oil and gas moved to the Louisiana, by the 80s, it had moved into the 3-mile limit of state waters and then actually all the way out into the deep Gulf. Okay. In addition to that, got to remember we have refineries here too. So there's pipelines that are run through all these wetlands. And in addition to that, we have some other things like all these fertilizers coming down the Mississippi River and creating dead zones. So there's some other impacts. The main two things though, leveeing the Mississippi River, creating levees to protect us in greater New Orleans mostly, okay? And all these canals for navigation in the early exploration phases. So the damage has been done, it's going on, we're trying to save what we can now. Just read Bob Marshall, Mark Slevstein. They have been writing about this for 20 years. Okay. There's roles for government and so the state of Louisiana, well, first off, U.S. federal government created all those levees down the Mississippi River. Now, it wasn't because they just thought it was a great idea, they wanted to do make work. There were local communities and states begging them to do it, including Lower Plaquemines and da-da-da, okay? So they enabled that. Did they collude? Was it collusion? Not exactly, but yeah. So the U.S. is responsible, the state is responsible, local communities in a sense are responsible because they wanted to do these things for lots of reasons, and the multinational corporations were responsible too. Now all this responsibility, the reason why I'm mentioning it all and laying this landscape is it does have something to do with who should pay for this now, and it does have something to do with understanding this whole history and how people feel about it. Okay, what's at stake? Well, I'd say survival, state of, New Orleans, greater New Orleans, not just the folks that live down south, at the mouth of the river in Venice, and, going along the coast all the way over to Cameron Parish. Yeah, those local communities are threatened. They've mostly been devastated already. A lot of those folks have left. Okay. But also everyone living in New Orleans, greater New Orleans. What's gonna happen? New Orleans is an economic engine for the whole state of Louisiana. The state has a stake. About 1/3 of the state's budget is royalties for oil and gas. They have a stake. There's no drilling, etc., right on land now or within 3 miles. There's virtually none. But there's pipelines everywhere. Okay. The ports and commerce, that is a big stake, for sure. Ecotourism, yep. and again, the survival of Greater New Orleans. Okay, what to do? So I arrived here in 1986, and right at that time, several important things happened. One of the things that happened was the Outer Continental Shelf Fund created a $1 billion fund to pay for offshore royalties beyond 3 miles, because oil and gas had already moved beyond 3 miles from the Louisiana coast. And Louisiana did something totally bizarre. They took that money and they put it in a special fund called the Louisiana Support Fund. And you know what? I just got a distinguished professorship, and Professor Block has an endowed chair, and that fund paid for us to be here, and a lot of other endowed chairs. It's weird because the state of Louisiana actually did one of the best things possible, which is just relative to higher education. You know, they made a mistake, obviously, you know, not normal for sure.
5-minute warning.
Thanks. But anyway, since then, it was by the mid-late 1980s, we recognized exactly what needed to be done. We had to somehow or another mitigate, but not mitigate, to hold the water back, to restore coastal Louisiana. We needed to do serious engineering, and so all sorts of diversions were planned. So it's all been about engineering, honestly. The challenge, though, is, well, what's the proper scale? And one of the papers I listed here by Craig Colton, who's a geographer at LSU, is very challenging. He summarizes all these management pieces, 2017, all these, and he says, you know, it's all been engineering. We've not been dealing with social, cultural issues at all. And that's a big challenge. So, okay, here we go. To get to the economics piece. What's the economics of this restoration? I'd say here's 4 questions, and I'll provide some answers, you know, my views. Did economic and market forces cause this collapse? Yep, sure did. I mean, there were strong economic pieces, for sure. This, not just for jobs, but for revenue for the state of Louisiana. Yeah, still today, 1/3. Yeah, John Bell Edwards won't agree that Bayou Bridge pipeline should be shut down because that's the money. That's the real new money. Who's responsible? Well, actually a lot of people. The U.S. government is. The whole nation is for what we've delivered for 70 years in energy. Louisiana is. And even, of course, these companies that did the original dredging and still operate today. Who should pay? Or maybe a better way to put it, who can pay? Okay. Federal government, that's the biggest money we got. Okay? For sure. The state can do some and is, you know, needs to do matching. These private, you know, mega corporations should too. BP oil spill did some damage. To be honest, we took that $14 billion. And we're paying. I mean, Bob Marshall's talked about this Sunday when he was on Harry Shearer's show. Yeah, we took that $14 billion and we're using it. Not, BP didn't cause all that damage, but that's the money. Should they pay? Yep. And then finally, who are the real stakeholders? And this is really hard, and Craig Colton's paper really challenges us because, yeah, the folks that still live, about 10,000 people, roughly, across the whole coastal Louisiana and those coastal communities. Yeah, they have a serious stake. Well, so do 1 million people living in Greater New Orleans. And so do the 7.5 million people that live in the state of Louisiana. And so do other people all across the country that care about these things. So, there you go.
Dr. Block, you have 15 minutes on the clock.
I have a very weak voice, so if you can't hear me, please come closer to the front. There are plenty of seats here. Did you hear me say that in the back? Great. I take a shower once a month, whether I need it or not, so I won't smell you up too much if you come to the front. So please come to the front if you can't hear me. My understanding of the title of the debate was, Gulf Coastal Restoration is a market failure. Yes or no? And I say it's not a market failure because there's been no markets. Therefore, it can't be a market failure. Why are there no markets? Because there's no private property. The Gulf of Mexico is not owned by any private person. The wetlands are not owned by any private person. Therefore, you can't have the market. It's mainly government that is at fault. So then the question is, well, how can we restore the situation? And my answer is, water and land are alike. From an economic point of view, there's no distinction. Now, maybe from a chemical point of view or biological point of view, but from an economic point of view, they're the same. It's true water moves around a little bit more, it sloshes all over the place, and land sort of stays still, but there's some land that moves, mudslides, and there's some water that's pretty stable, icebergs. Not moving ones, but Antarctica. So I treat them the same, and now I ask myself, well, suppose my colleague Craig says there's a collapse. Well, suppose there was a collapse in the land north of Lake Pontchartrain. What would I say should be done? I would say the owner should get on the stick. The owner should figure out what to do. And if they do a good job, they'll make profits, and if they do a bad job, they'll lose money. And if they lose money, they'll be supplanted by other people. So my answer to the problem is privatize. My motto is, if it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. Since everything either moves or doesn't move, you privatize everything. We even privatized Professor Clark.
Of course.
Right.
You're going to try anyway.
He's a private person.
We'll see if it works.
So my solution to the Gulf Coast problem is government keep its hands off, let the magic of the market work. Laissez-faire capitalism is the best system on land, and laissez-faire capitalism will be the best system on the water, because there's no real important difference between land and water. Now, there are only three choices as to how we can deal with anything. One is government, but government is very inefficient. Let me give you an example of this. In the Soviet Union, there was private land and then there was public land. And on the private land, private was 3% and the public was 97%. And on the amount of crops was 25% here and 75% there, which shows a great disproportion. And a similar sort of a thing exists. This isn't really fair, but all's fair in love, we're in debates. If we look at the water and we look at the land, well, percentage of the Earth's surface is 75 and 25, and the GDP is about 1% and 99%. That's a little unfair because most of the people are on the land, but what the heck? This shows that we're not getting as much out of the water as we are out of the land, and part of the explanation, not the total explanation, but part of the explanation is we have private property in land and we don't have any private property in the water. One of my books is a book called Water Capitalism. Water Capitalism, the case for privatizing oceans, rivers, lakes, and aquifers. I wanted to put mud puddles in there, but the publisher balked. And we make the case that we should privatize all bodies of water, oceans, rivers, lakes, aquifers, whatever, and then the magic of the market could work their way through the bodies of water as they work on the land. We know that Sovietized collective agriculture didn't work. Look at that disproportion. The incentives were all wrong. People would let tractors rust on the land. Very, very bad thing. Whereas the 3% that was privately owned in the form of a front yard or a backyard was very, very productive. So I think we can extrapolate from that. Another example is, let's look at the post office compared to Fed Express. Post office is very, very inefficient. Fed Express is very efficient. Another one would be sanitation removal. to move a ton of sanitation by a private company is about 1/4 the expense of moving it from a public sanitation enterprise. Why is this? Why is it that we have pretty good jackets and pretty good wristwatches and pretty good ties and pretty good eyeglasses and pretty good desks and pretty good shoes and pretty good everything? It's because if you don't do a good job, you lose money. And if you lose enough money, you go bankrupt. And if you go bankrupt, you have to leave the industry and go do something else. And the people who remain are a little bit better than you, and that's why everything is pretty good. Nothing is excellent, nothing is perfect. We're not on the right side of the Garden of Eden for that. But things are pretty good with regard to things that the market is producing. Compare that to government. 1,900 people died, not from the Katrina. Katrina missed us by about 40 miles. Why did people die? Because the levees fell. The levees broke. Now, the humanist in me says 1,900 people, my God, that's horrible. The economist in me says, who cares about people? You know, we have cash registers for hearts and dollar signs on our eyeballs. The thing that bugs us as economists, or at least bugs me as an economist, is those people are still in business. The Army Corps of Engineers is still in business. Isn't that horrible? Whereas if any private company were responsible for 1,900 deaths, they wouldn't be around anymore. We'd have better things going on. Very similar with the Boeing plane and the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, I don't know if they made the right choice or not by waiting so long to get rid of those planes or to down those planes. But if they made the wrong decision, are they going to go broke? No. They'll still be in business no matter what. Same thing with the TSA. If, God forbid, a terrorist gets through, what we need is competition. Different companies providing certification to make sure that the terrorists don't come in. The FDA screwed up with thalidomide. The FDA is still in business. We don't want that. We want instead good housekeeping and consumer reports and things like that. You know how they test mattresses? Mattresses the last 10, 15 years, they take a thing and they sort of bump the mattress, and then they tell us which is the best mattress. Well, if they tell us the wrong thing, they go broke. That's why we have pretty good certification agencies. So I think government is a disaster. We don't want government. Government is inefficient, and it's also immoral. It's also evil, because government is based on coercion. If you don't pay your taxes, they'll put you in jail, and you didn't agree to pay your taxes. So, I mean, if I came up to you with a gun and I said, hey, give me money, I'll use it for good purposes, we know what I'd be, a thief. Well, the government is a thief. So not only are they inefficient, they're evil. So we shouldn't rely on government, we should look to the private enterprise system. Okay, so that's one possibility. Well, that's two possibilities. One is private, one is government. The third one is non-ownership. That's what really occurs in the Gulf of Mexico. No one owns the Gulf of Mexico. No one owns the Atlantic Ocean. No one owns the Mississippi River. This is an abomination. We got to have ownership. Otherwise, we can't have economic rationality with regard to these very important issues, with regard to these very important values. So if we had privatization, we would then have more rationality. So what's wrong with non-ownership? What's wrong with non-ownership is the tragedy of the commons. Look, the cow never went within 1,000,000 miles of extinction. The word extinction and the word cow don't belong in the same sentence. The buffalo almost went extinct. And yet the buffalo and the cow, with apologies to my biology colleagues, they're the same animal. Okay, maybe a different species, but they're both big and fat and they smell, and if you crash into one, you're in trouble. They both have horns. They're the same animal from an economic point of view. Why did one almost go extinct and the other never went within 1,000,000 miles of extinction? One was always privately owned. The other was not privately owned. If you own a cow, what's the cost to you of slaughtering your cow? You don't have a cow tomorrow. That's a pretty big cost. If during the days of buffalo weren't owned, and if what's the cost to you of killing a buffalo? Virtually nothing, because you wouldn't have the buffalo next day anyway.
5-minute warning.
And as far as I'm concerned, the elephant and the rhino are just big, funny-looking cows. The reason that they are on the verge of extinction is they're not privately owned. You want to save them? Let's privatize them, and then people will take care of them, and if they don't do a good job, they'll lose money. A lot of private companies have gone broke. Let me read a list to you. Nash, Rambler, Pan Am, Packard, Hewlett-Packard, Kodak, Radio Shack, Circuit City, Enron, Blockbuster, Tower Records, Polaroid, Lehman Brothers, Toys R Us, Border Books, General Motors, Chrysler, Texaco, Mercury, Saab, Hummer, Studebaker, DeSoto, Edsel. Companies go broke when they don't do a good job. A lot of horse and buggy industry went broke when the automobile came in. That is the reason why we have pretty good stuff. Well, all I'm trying to do is extrapolate. I'm trying to say, why are we successful on the land and not successful on the water? And it's got nothing to do with chemistry, nothing to do with biology. It's got all to do with economics. Namely, we have private ownership, we have responsibility, we have profit and loss, and that's why things are pretty good but not perfect on the land. And all I'm saying is we've got to extrapolate from that. I was once in a debate with a much nastier fellow than Craig, and I talked about free market environmentalism. And the guy burst out laughing. But it was an honest laugh. It wasn't an attempt to put me down by laughing, because he'd never heard of that. The very idea just seemed preposterous to him. And he was an environmentalist, a left-wing environmentalist, not a free market environmentalist. I don't think that our friends, the socialists, should have a monopoly over the word environmentalism. We free market environmentalists have the same goals, namely a healthy planet. But we have very different means. Some of us, my colleague Craig, I think, to a great degree, and other people in the audience that I know, other professors here, think that government is the way to solve these problems. I think government is a disaster. We shouldn't rely on government at all. Let me give you a little bit of other information about free market environmentalism in areas unrelated to the Gulf of Mexico, and then I will talk about a little bit more about water privatization. Well, are we ever going to run out of resources? No, we're never going to run out of resources, which is a problem, because when you start to run out of resources, copper, oil, whatever it is, cows, buffalo, what happens to the price of the resource? Well, the price of the resource rises. And when the price of the resource rises, this is part of the magic of the marketplace, people use less of it. And other people try to find more of it or try to find substitutes for it. So we never run out of anything thanks to the marketplace. Another one is there any crisis between, say, bubble gum and shoes? Do we have the right proportion of bubble gum and shoes? Even the New York Times isn't complaining that the market failed here. Yeah, I assume it's the right proportion. How about celery and tennis rackets? No problem. Why no problem? Because if there is a problem, market forces will be brought to bear to change things. For example, if we have too much celery and not enough tennis rackets, well, too much celery means the price of celery goes down. Not enough tennis rackets means the price of tennis rackets goes up. People will be led by Adam Smith's invisible hand to produce more tennis rackets and less celery. Well, what's this got to do with anything? What this has got to do with is not only celery and tennis rackets in proportion, roughly correct proportion, but so is land for farms and land for houses. And so is land and water. My colleague Bob Thomas is always complaining, well, we're losing 1 or 2 football fields worth of wetlands every month or every week or every hour or whatever it is. First, my question is, well, what's the proper proportion of water and land? And you just can't dictate this unless you're an economic dictator, and I'm certainly not. The question is, you see, if you had ownership of both of these, then the market would allocate them in a roughly correct proportion, just as it does with tennis rackets and celery. But since one of them isn't owned, then with the water we can't.
30-second warning.
20 seconds?
30.
30 seconds. Wow,
Go for it.
I could knock your socks off in 30 seconds.
Go for it.
Thanks for your attention.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Hood, you have 10 minutes to rebut Dr. Block's remarks.
So actually, I had in my original notes to talk about the fact that wetlands and coastal systems are not excludable that they're not market products. So I agree with you completely, absolutely, that the market has nothing to, free markets have nothing to do with coastal systems. I mean, one of the fundamental facts is that these are not just abiotic systems, they are alive. It's not just that there's plants and animals living in wetland ecosystems or any other ecosystems, even the ones that are above Lake Pontchartrain. Although there's a lot of pastures and, you know, we've nuked the diversity off the North Shore except for a couple little tiny places like Fontainebleau State Park and a few other places like that. So they're alive. They're not to be marketed for some philosophical reason, although there's, I think, philosophical reasons why they shouldn't be privatized. People have lived on, I lived on them. You're describing the biology of cows and buffaloes? Okay, I'm totally good. I'm totally good with it. That's not why buffaloes almost went extinct. Buffaloes almost went extinct because the Native Americans, Lakota and others that were hunting buffaloes were doing so sustainably, but sustainably only because their populations weren't big enough and they didn't have guns at the time they were hunting them. Now, when trainloads of Easterners went out and slaughtered the buffalo, yep, and they were paid, and they paid to do it, like big game hunts. So why do we need governments to exist and function? Because who is going to support those who can't pay? Where otherwise they're going to suffer or maybe even die. And I'll give two very general examples outside of the Gulf Coast. Food. So, food and big pharma, prescription drugs. So, you pay what the market will do, will handle. So corn and soybeans in the U.S. are being produced to feed cows mostly, chickens, and to sell to folks that can pay the market. But people that are living subsistence that need that corn and soybeans and have actually been using them and buying them, they can't pay. So if you can't pay, you're out of luck. I think that's one of the reasons why we need to have societal structures and government. I guess one has to, one big difference, it's not just like physical differences between water and land, but we have a living system here in Louisiana on our Gulf Coast. As damaged as it is, we have a living system that is keeping our living community, human communities alive, okay? Including even greater, as I mentioned earlier, greater New Orleans, flood protection, all that as well. One of the other papers I had was a large meta-analysis done of 20 locations from Maine to Galveston, Texas, and all of the ecosystem benefits, independent of people, and people benefits of those wetlands and what all the challenges are there. These are living systems. When we look at most of America today, we've transformed the landscape, and it's not in the last 5 years, it was 50, 60 plus or more. We used to have a great eastern deciduous forest. It's been gone for almost 200 years, plowed down. We now have commercial pine plantations in Mississippi as far as the eye can see. They're renewable energy. Actually, it's renewable 2x4s. Okay, but it's a monoculture. It's not any different than the lawn across the street or a cornfield. It's not just that there's no market. These are living systems.
Thank you, Dr. Hood. Dr. Block, you have 10 minutes on the clock.
In his opening, Craig mentioned the collapse Well, the collapse is due to government. The collapse is due to all sorts of government and involvement with large corporations, which I call economic fascism or crony capitalism as opposed to laissez-faire capitalism. So I agree with him that there are grave problems. If we don't spruce up and maybe spruce up literally and figuratively, the wetlands, the storms come in and they knock out New Orleans. So we need to spiff them up. What are the Chinese doing? The Chinese are taking half-submerged little rocks or islands that are at high tide, they're underwater, at low tide, they're above water, and they're taking sand from all over the place and making islands out of that. Well, if I own some of the wetlands, look, that land right west of Kenner is just wetlands, and Kenner real estate is pretty valuable. If I own some of that wetlands just west of Kenner or the wetlands down south of here, I would put in some trees, I'd get some sand, I would protect New Orleans, not because I wanted to, but because it would mean profit for me. So if we could privatize those wetlands and allow farmers to own them and then put more sand there and build them up and put trees in there, the New Orleans would be safer and we'd have more crops. So it's a win-win situation. He talks about fertilizer, levees, pipelines, canals, all government, all with government permission. Whereas if individuals own that stuff, and you want to put a pipeline through my property and it's going to undermine my property, well, I'll only allow the pipeline if it's really, really valuable. Namely, we can have a cost-benefit analysis, whereas with government, you just don't have that. He says, economic and market forces led to the collapse. Sort of, yes. Crony capitalist economic forces led to it. Fascist economics, where government is very heavily involved, yes, that led to it. I'm not saying economics is innocent. I'm just saying laissez-faire economics, economic freedom is not responsible. Now, he raises the question, well, what about the poor? This is a criticism that's often mentioned against the market. Well, another book of mine, I didn't think to bring it along, but another book of mine, what we did is we took a survey of the economic freedom of about 150 countries. We just measured the economic freedom. And then we looked at the GDP per capita. And you'll never guess what. If you've been paying attention, you would expect a very positive correlation. The countries that are more economically free, the poor are much richer. In our country, which is relatively free, the poor here do much, much better than even the middle class in some other countries where they don't have economic freedom. So if you're worried about the poor, again, the answer is capitalism. Look, what is the marketplace? What is capitalism? What is free enterprise? All it is voluntary trade between consenting adults. And every time there's a trade, whether it's a purchase or a sale or barter or lending or borrowing or renting, there's necessarily mutual gain in the ex ante sense. You all have shoes. You bought those shoes for, let's say, 30 bucks. How much did you value those shoes when you bought them? More than 30 bucks, otherwise you wouldn't have bought it. If you only bought it valued it at 30, you wouldn't have bought it because there'd be no profit in it for you. How much did the person who sold you those shoes value those shoes at? Less than 20 bucks. So the Marxists would say, well, there was mutual exploitation. I would say there's mutual benefit. And this goes for every aspect of the marketplace. You bought a computer from Bill Gates for 500 bucks, you valued it at more than 500 bucks, you made a profit off of him. He made a profit off of you. That's all the market is. The market is a magical enriching machine. So if you're worried about the poor, whereas government, there's no enrichment, the government takes money from you whether you like it or not. How does that benefit you? And then it gives you some money. Keeps a lot in Washington, around Washington, D.C. So I think 7 out of the 10 richest counties are all around Washington, D.C., because a lot of money goes there and a little less of it comes back to us. It's just an impoverishing kind of machine. Craig talks about living systems. Well, yeah, they're living systems. He also mentions big game hunters. Look, if I had a herd of elephants, would I allow you guys to come shoot them? Yes. There'd be more money in it for me. Now, if you wanted to shoot an old male or an old female elephant, I would charge you, $10,000, $20,000. If you wanted to shoot a young female elephant, I would charge you, the sky's the limit, because they are the limitation on population. And I would protect all those elephants against poachers. The reason those buffalo went, I was gonna say went broke, but went almost extinct, and the reason that the elephants and the rhinos are in trouble is not because the tusks are valuable, it's because they're not privately owned, they're not protected. People go and kill an elephant just for the tusks, and they leave the meat and the skin alone, and it's just a horror. Botswana is the country in Africa that has the most free enterprise with elephants, and the herds are increasing. The other places are much more communistic, we can't have private ownership of elephants, and their herds are decreasing. With regard to forests, one of my next projects is to try to demonstrate that there's more forest fires on government forests than on private forests. Because if I own a private forest and the thing burns up, I lose money. And I go broke, and somebody else will take over for me and maybe do a better job. Whereas, when is the last time that somebody lost money in the government or the enterprise went broke? Never. Let me talk just a little bit more about who should own the Mississippi River and how should the Mississippi River be run. Well, the way we decide who owns these things in this book of mine about privatization is John Locke. We're fans of John Locke, and John Locke said you own your own body, and when you mix your labor with the land and the water now, he never mentioned water, you get to own it. Well, who's been mixing their labor with the Mississippi River? The people who've got those boats up and down the Mississippi River, those big boat kind of things, those ships, carrying lumber or oil. All the people who've got land on the side of the Mississippi River, all the way up to, I don't know, Minnesota or somewhere. Well, you must have 100,000 people now, and what you do is you give each one of them a share, and you list that Mississippi River Corporation on the New York Stock Exchange, and people can buy and sell shares, and if something goes wrong, you sue the Mississippi River. If somebody pollutes the Mississippi River and makes it warmer and the fish die, well, the Mississippi River Corporation will stop that. And it's the same thing for oceans or lakes or what have you. Namely, what I'm trying to do is put water on the same sort of economic rationality situation as land is. Let me try another one on you. What about the plastic and paper situation? Namely, I'm trying to give you an inkling as to what free market environmentalism is all about. And here we have plastic, and here we have paper, and here we're running out of ink.
Yeah, they always do.
2-minute warning.
What is the cost of buying the thing? Well, the cost of buying it is a penny versus a penny. And I'm going to assume that paper is a great thing because it's biodegradable, and plastic is evil. Styrofoam is no good. There are acres and acres, maybe square miles of plastic bags in the ocean, killing the fish and stuff. So is there any invisible hand? Is there Adam Smith's invisible hand leading us away from evil plastic, which I'm assuming is evil, and toward paper? No, it's a penny versus a penny. So why isn't the magic of the market working? Because we forgot something. Not only do you have to buy it, but you have to dispose of it also. And assuming that the cost of paper disposal is easy because it's biodegradable, I'll put in a penny. And here I'll put in $5. The cost of disposing of a plastic bag is $5. But we don't have to pay $5. Why don't we have to pay $5? Because the goddamn government is in charge of all the dump sites, and they just charge you a tax per year, and you don't have to pay every time you put in a plastic bag. But if all the garbage dump sites were privatized, and it costs $5, the market would lead us to a charge of $5. And now you would get 2 cents versus 5.01. And now, the only plastic bags we would use is when their value is worth more than 5.01. Well, what kind of plastic bags are that? Well, the other week, I had hip surgery, and they replaced my hip. And guess what they did while I was in bed there? They had this plastic bag dripping stuff into my body.
30 seconds.
And then those kind of plastic bags would be legitimate. But you see, right now we have no economic rationality. But again, it's due to the fact that the government has taken over and we don't have any economic rationality.
Dr. Hood, you have 5 5 minutes
Why
for
don't we-
concludatory
why don't we
remarks.
do Q&A and then we'll have this.
Or do we want to do Q&A?
I'm good for Q&A.
And then we can
You
start.
guys want to go at it?
All right, so this begins
Yeah.
our session of question and answer. So we will take questions from the audience. You're allowed to ask Dr. Block or Dr. Hood or both a question, and they will have at most 2 minutes to respond.
And let me just say, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment, but limited to a minute or so.
Okay?
Okay. I happen not to be a defender of either capitalism or the state. And I think there are good empirical grounds for not being a defender of either.
John, can I make a suggestion? Speak louder to the people in the back.
Oh, sorry. I wouldn't want to defend capitalism against the state or the state against capitalism because they have a very bad record. And they have such a bad record that we're now in the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth, basically through cooperative activity of capitalism in the state. Walter, you mentioned your ideal capitalism, but it isn't historical capitalism. In fact, everywhere in the world there is a coalition between the state. And in fact, most of what we call property has nothing to do with the free market. It has to do with a market which is established through law. So everything we've had in history, certainly modern history, is about capitalism and the state. So that's one problem. I can't really get into it, but I don't believe what you propose will ever happen or really could happen given the nature of history. But I think we have to look at history, and we have to look at science, we have to look at what exists in the world. Unfortunately, there's some things that cannot have owners. Plankton, for instance. One reason why we're in ecological crisis is because, there's phytoplankton and zooplankton and so forth, and it would be very difficult for some corporation to know exactly which plankton it owns in the sea, or which microorganisms. Much of the ecology of the earth is microorganisms in the soil and so forth. By the way, all animals are not the ones you relate to. There are a lot of plants, a lot of animals that you don't relate to that are part of the problematic of the continuation of life on Earth. So that's one thing I would pose. And with Hurricane Katrina, for instance, you did, in that case, you mentioned the state. There was Bow Brothers Construction Company, and there was massive involvement of capitalism in the kind of construction and collaboration between so-called private enterprise and the state to lead to those kind of catastrophes. But, I don't want to say, I wanted to say one thing about history and empirical evidence. There's a woman named Eleanor Ostrom who won the Nobel Prize for economics. And her life's work was to study state management of basically ecosystems or bioregions or the land. And secondly, private ownership. And third, not Garrett Hardin's fake commons, but the real commons, where you have common management by a local community. Overwhelmingly, the best results are democratic management by a local community. That's the answer that history gives. And I really do believe that if we don't shift from centralized state bureaucratic control and the closest thing to what you're proposing, which is actually existing capitalism, that we are going to continue on the road to collapse. And we will have an ecological collapse in the very near future. So those are some of the questions I would pose about, I like to see how someone would not only defend, capitalism in history, but also the state in history, since neither one has done very well at all.
You want to go first?
I'll say I absolutely agree with you that I would even use the word that the U.S. and also Louisiana colluded with oil and gas from the 1930s on. So the states, in that sense, it definitely, is a bad history. There's no doubt about that. But I think one thing about our situation in coastal Louisiana, and some other places too, but especially coastal Louisiana, we can look at Norfolk and Virginia, whatever, is scale. So 100 people, a 100-person community in Lower Plaquemines cannot, whatever they muster, they can't save the wetlands at the scale that we need it to be saved. So I'm going to use another word, which is kind of a strong word, but actually Oliver Howe, in many of his publications and arguments in legal, has used it. It's almost a matter of reparations for damage done both by this partnership of government and corporations. And that's a hard word. It's a hard thing to get to. But the bottom line is, every BOMER, every single lease for mineral rights across the whole Gulf Coast, and then also on land too, has been granted by either federal or state agencies for fracking. Every bit of fracking is not just being done by some company deciding to frack. So it's being agreed to for various reasons. So Walter, you want to?
I wanted to answer John's question. Don't start my 2 minutes yet, but I wanted to put something on the board in behalf of both of us. It occurs to me that some of you might want to ask us questions that you're not going to get a chance to, so I'm going to put both of our email addresses on the board.
Yeah, no, here, I'll do it. Is it W block or block?
W block.
Okay. Give it
Okay, it's just W block at loyola.edu, and Craig would be
C Hood.
K.
Yeah.
Okay, so while he's doing that, let me try to answer John's questions. Now you can start my 2 minutes. I don't see why you can't own plankton. Of course, plankton is stuck here and there, but if you own the whole body of water, you own the plankton in it. The same with the land. There's all sorts of creepy, crawly things in the land, and if you own a square mile of land, you own all the bugs and the worms. Yes, Bow Brothers and all these other companies are hand in glove with the government, but that's what I'm opposing. That's not what I'm favoring. This is economic fascism. This is crony capitalism. This is the enemy. I'm favoring laissez-faire capitalism, where the government doesn't give Bow Brothers or any other company carte blanche to just ruin the environment. Namely, we defend private property rights. Elinor Ostrom is a moron. I've written 3 or 4 articles showing why she's a moron. Now, it's true she's the only one that ever won the Nobel Prize in economics, but still, she's a moron. She doesn't distinguish between partnerships and communities. So if you're interested in my criticism of Elinor Ostrom, which I don't have time to do, email me and I'll send you some stuff on that.
That's very
Look,
good.
the question John raises is a very important question. Will this ever occur? Will we ever privatize the Gulf of Mexico? I don't give a rat's rear end if we will or not. I am only trying to get at the truth. Look, suppose it was just 1830 and I was saying we've got to end slavery. And everyone would say, well, you can't get rid of slavery. This is 1830, you know? Well, I would say as an abolitionist, I don't care whether you can get rid of slavery or not. I'm going to advocate getting rid of slavery to my last breath, whether it'll occur or not. I mean, I do care that we end slavery, and I do care that we privatize, but I don't really care whether it's practical. I just care whether it's just and whether it's truthful and whether it's righteous. And getting rid of slavery is a good thing, whether it's likely to happen or not, and privatizing the oceans is a good thing, whether it's likely to happen or not. So the fact that it's impractical is almost irrelevant, not quite. I mean, I would like it to be practical, and one of the ways I'll make it practical is to convince you all people that it's a good, virtuous thing to do, and the more people that think about that way, the more likely it is that we get rid of it, just as if I were an abolitionist in 1830. I'm an abolitionist of government property, and I'm an abolitionist of non-owned property. I'm an advocate of private property.
All right, next question. All right, let's see in the crowd.
So, if we suppose, this is more, sorry,
I can't hear you.
more for Dr. Block. So if we presuppose that laissez-faire is more productive for the environment and is cost-effective, it is common that changing from a government subsidized system to laissez-faire will take time and money. Yes, because the taxes that would be going in, that would be lost, because they would already be in the government, right?
Well, it'll take a lot of time, it'll take, look, Ron Paul got 1% of the vote. Bernie Sanders is doing a lot better than Ron Paul, so it'll take time.
So how do we quantify the loss of time that it would take to privatize on the Gulf? Because it does, we are losing that space and that time very quickly. Like, we don't have a lot of time. How do you quantify that even though it might be more cost effective in the long run, how do you quantify that changing and like that time lost is worth changing from the system that we already have, which is public?
Well, look, suppose I were a doctor and I say, don't smoke, it causes cancer. And the odds of me converting everyone to non-smoking are slim to none, and it'll take a lot of time. But still, see, all I'm trying to do is indicate what's the proper way to go. And the proper way to go is to privatize everything, in my view. Yes, it'll not only take time, the reason it'll take time is because I have to convince people. Suppose 90% of the public agree with me. We're all libertarians now. Well, it wouldn't take much time at all. The president, the Congress, all the Supreme Court people would be libertarians, and it would take very, very short time to privatize the Mississippi River, privatize the Gulf of Mexico. The big problem is most people disagree with me.
All right, next question?
In terms of the environment, we can't have set boundaries. We can't even keep Monsanto seeds on certain fields and out of other farmers' fields. It's not that simple, and it's not workable.
So here's another example besides that that's maybe also, sort of strong, which is fracking. So here's this new technology that actually expanded the potential to get oil and gas by going down very deep, using old well sites that were all abandoned almost 100 years ago, pumping down this stuff. But it's damaging aquifers. You could say, was it known or not? Yeah, there's clear evidence it was known. But, so those aquifers aren't just right over the little well site that some private landowner agreed, okay, yeah, you can drill and I'll get my royalties here. It could be an entire huge area. Sort of like the Mississippi River too, saying let's privatize Mississippi River. That is the water supply for the city of New Orleans and lots of other places, as well as agricultural water irrigation all along the way. There's actually massive floods right now in Nebraska and North and South Dakota, and that's on the Missouri River and upper Mississippi River. But anyway, these are systems. It's not just that they're alive, they are systems, and they have to be dealt with as systems. It's not all point source. In fact, there's not that much point source impacts.
I think this lady raises a very, very important question, and also Craig, the point about fracking. Yes, fracking ruins aquifers, and no one owns the aquifers. If I owned one and you started fracking and ruining it, I'd go to court and say, hey, you're polluting me. And it's the same with Monsanto seeds, although I've not done any work on Monsanto seeds. My work on this has been in pollution of dust particles, which is the same sort of a thing. Let me tell you a little story. In the 1830s, some little old lady hung out her washing on a clothesline, and when it was hung out, it was wet and clean. She comes back 3 hours later, and it is dry and dirty. She goes to court, and she says, I want two things. I want an injunction and damages. Damages means money. That their factory did it. I want money out of them, and I want an injunction. What's an injunction? A letter from the court saying, we'll let you get away with it this time, but if you keep doing it, we're putting your rear end in jail. Did the environmental plaintiff always win in the 1830s? No, the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. Possession is 9/10 of the law, fine. But the courts were open to it. Then what happened in the progressive period, starting in around 1880 and going into about 1930, the US wanted to be number one. How do you get to be number one? How do you get battleships? How do you get tanks and jeeps and stuff like that? Do you allow little old ladies to run roughshod over corporations that are polluting? Do you allow farmers to sue railroads for putting sparks on their haystacks? No. During the 1830s, the fact that you could sue the plaintiff could sue the defendant, the plaintiff could sue the polluter, meant that the polluter would be led by an invisible hand to use anthracite coal rather than sulfur coal, because anthracite coal is much cleaner burning and it's more expensive, but you don't get little old ladies on your case. Also, they would put meshes or things in their chimneys to keep the pollution down. Not 100%, but 90, 95%, whatever. Things were pretty good. Then in the 1890s and thereafter, the U.S. wanted to be number one, and the court, when the environmental plaintiff comes into court, the court says, yeah, they're violating your private property rights, your stinking, selfish, lousy private property rights. There's something more important than private property rights, and that is the public good. And what does the public good consist of? Pollution. Let me read you a very brief passage from the case, the Holman versus Athens Empire Laundry Company. The Supreme Court of Georgia declared the pollution of the air, so long as it is necessary for the enjoyment of life and indispensable to the progress of society, is not actionable. Not actionable. Well, if you're a green businessman, you're going to go back to the sulfur coal because it's cheaper. And if you insist on anthracite coal and you put meshes in your chimneys, you'll go broke because your competitors are using cheaper means of production. So the reason for the pollution problem and also the Monsanto thing, you can't sue them. If you can sue them, then you keep their crap to themselves, but you can't sue them. So now we have the Clean Air Act, namely the government screws up in the first place, and then the government says, my God, there's a problem, it's all capitalism's fault, and we gotta have more government. No, the government should have protected private property rights in the first place, and then the pollution problem would have been nipped in the bud.
Next question?
Got a few, but I'll start with this one. This is for both of you. And neither one of you addressed this, and I think it should be on the table, is that changes in our systems on our planet do not care about political borders. They do not care about whether you are a socialist or whether you are a capitalist. Things are moving, right? And so your idea to privatize in order to save coastal restoration, and your idea to use our government as well as the hand-in-hand with capitalistic industry to help out if regulations allow it, that's still not going to stop sea level rise, right? Sea level rise is a direct correlation to the fact that our planet is warming. Those glaciers that you talked about that you could buy are now melting in the sea, which is a conveyor belt of moving water. There's no way you could ever buy a part of the ocean and have it stay there, as the ocean is consistently moving due to currents and tides, okay? So how do you propose to save coastal Louisiana, even privately or in the government, if we are acting as a species on this planet and we are killing it? It doesn't matter what you do if you own that football field worth of land that hopefully isn't going to wash into the sea, or if you have the government try and help us, if globally of our actions as a species, as part of this ecology of the biomes of our planet, is going to consistently degrade any efforts that you are putting privately or government to save our coastlines.
When I was writing my notes for my 15 minutes, I had climate change right at the top, and then I'm not a debater, but I was told you should always hold back like your best argument. And so, okay, so we cannot, the only response to the global scale and all of its impact of climate change and all of its impacts, including mass migrations, all of it, is for global level scale responses. And there has to be a willingness to have cooperation that scales to that, even though think globally, act locally. You have local communities doing what they can locally with the resources they have locally. And so, quite frankly, it is an existential threat. We must control greenhouse gases, but also lots of other things like water. The crisis of water is almost as bad or worse. And so, how do you accomplish that? Well, fortunately, you do need global scale compacts. Maybe the IPCC pieces haven't worked because they've been compromised and didn't go as far as they needed to go. But try to get a solution to that, which is absolutely, the crisis of today, impacting, like, hey, look, the Pentagon, all the leaders of the Pentagon figured out over 20 years ago that climate change was the single biggest threat to U.S. defense worldwide, because there would be increasing struggles. Locally spreading, regionally spreading, globally. So it's going to take a level of cooperation that I don't know if humans have the capacity today to do it.
I have a very different answer. I'm not a weatherman or a climatologist or anything. I'm just a dumb economist. But I notice certain things. There's a debate among astronomers as to whether Pluto is a planet or something else. But I notice that nobody is threatening anyone else's job if they disagree with them. Nobody is threatening to put anyone in jail if they disagree with them on Pluto.
What if they say it doesn't exist?
In physics, there's also a debate between people who say reality is more like a wave and those who say it's more like a particle. But again, nobody is threatening to put anyone in jail. Nobody's threatening to lose anyone's job. In the environmental warming issue, that's not true. Namely, the people who claim that there's global warming or climate change or whatever they're claiming are threatening not only losing people's jobs, but to put them in jail. So what do I deduce from this? What I deduce from this is that if they were really right, they wouldn't have to do that. Look, the earth is flat. Some people believe that the earth is flat. But you don't go to jail if you don't believe that. And I guess you lose your job. You're going to lose your job in geography. Now, with regard to the, look, in the 1970s, you see, I believe that the proper way to describe left-wing environmentalists, socialist environmentalists, is like a watermelon. Red on the inside and only green on the outside. Namely, there are some people that like to run other people's lives. And they had a good vehicle for a long while, communism. And that sort of fell apart in 1971 when East Germany and West Germany and the Soviet Union fell apart. So they needed a new vehicle, rather a new horse to pull their vehicle of coercing people. And what was it? It was the environment. And in the 1970s, the indictment was global cooling. And guess who was at fault? Capitalism. Then in the 1990s, they switched 180 degrees, and guess what the indictment was? Global warming. And then you get all sorts of freezing weather that we've had since then, and now they call it climate change. The point is that these people, these green watermelon types, the verdict is always clear. It's capitalism's fault. The indictment is different. Now look, as an economist, I don't trust them. But suppose it were true. Let's stipulate. Look, I'm just saying as an outsider to the climate debate, I don't know. But I see one group is maligning and viciously treating the other group, so I deduce from that that the first group is, if they were right, they wouldn't have to do that.
I don't even know which group you're talking about, but keep going.
Oh, I'm talking about the group that want to intervene in the economy, that don't want economic freedom, and that want to run other people's lives, namely the left-wing environmentalists. Those are the people I'm talking about, the watermelons. And they think that it's warming, cooling, whatever it is. They keep changing the indictment, but the verdict is always clear. But let's suppose it was true. Let's suppose it was actually true. that if you have whatever it is, it'll lead to disaster. Well, then it's like having an atom bomb in your basement. We would have laws against it. But the burden of proof is on those who want to make the claim, and I don't think that they're anywhere near making that claim. So I reject that tentatively because I don't see any evidence for it. And I see evidence against it, namely that they're trying to put other people in jail and lose their jobs.
Okay, if you don't believe the evidence that we're presenting to you, I don't know what to do then.
Man in the purple sweater.
Okay, yeah, you didn't actually, even though you refuted, you still did, there's proof that the water is rising, so what is your answer to what he just asked? Kind of just went around it and kind of dodged.
Look, the Arctic icebergs are melting, the Antarctic ones are getting bigger.
No.
No.
That's my understanding. Take care. I don't trust these people because they try to put people who disagree with them in jail.
It's just a matter of measuring
But
ice.
if it were true, but look,
It's easy to quantify.
if it were true, and let's stipulate that it's true,
Stipulate.
well, then I would say that doing things that these people claim would then be an invasion of other people's property rights, and the law should stop them.
The law should stop what? Global warming.
No, the law should stop human action that leads to global warming.
That sounds exactly opposite of what you were just telling us the whole time, isn't it? Because now you're telling them that the government, and I'm just playing both sides of the coin here.
No.
So I thought your argument, if I can articulate it back to you, is that the government should regulate fossil fuel emissions then.
I didn't say the government should, look, I'm an anarchist, I don't believe in government.
Okay,
But
somebody should, you just said that,
somebody
right?
should, namely private courts. But if we have a government, then the government, look, I wanted the government in the 1830s to allow plaintiffs to sue for pollution. So I'm now wearing my government hat. And the government was acting properly in the 1830s. Namely, they were allowing environmental plaintiffs to sue polluters. Fine. If it were proven that what these claims are, that the water is rising and then there's global warming or global change or cooling or whatever it is, and it was bad, then I would say that the government or whoever should make a law against that. So we agree. We only disagree that you think that it's proven, I think it's not proven.
We don't prove anything in science, we alleviate uncertainty.
So, you had your hand, I want to give you a shot way back there, because you've been trying.
Yeah, I had a question. It was more directed at Dr. Block, and had to give a specific example of, saving elephants or rhinos through privatization. And you say there's good businesses and bad businesses. Good businesses make money, bad businesses don't. Correct. Well, let's say rhinos are not privatized. I buy up a whole bunch of rhinos or elephants, whatever animal. If it's a bad business and I mishandle my herd, and all these animals die, and the result is that there's no more of these rhinos left. So how do you protect bad businesses from, how do you protect these rhinos animals from bad business decisions which could lead to extinction without government regulation?
Here's a joke. The economist was asked, how is your wife? The answer was, compared to what? Maybe it's not that funny, but it's funny among economists. The point is, look, human beings make mistakes. We got out of bed, it's a mistake. We go to bed, it's a mistake. Every day we make mistakes. The point is, one system, if you make a mistake, you get penalized automatically. You lose money and other people take your place. The other system, you make a mistake, you don't. Okay, so there'd be a lot of people that owned elephants or rhinos. Some of them, like me, I would screw up, and Craig over here would do a much better job, and what would happen is that I would lose money, and he might take over my herd. So that's why we have pretty good pens and pretty good wristwatches. Do people who make pens make a mistake? Yes. And the ones who make a mistake, they go broke, and other people make those pens. It would be the same thing with regard to elephants. Some elephant, some cow, some owners of chickens or whatever it is will make mistakes and they'll go broke. Others will take over take over the industry, and we'll have pretty good elephant saving.
If I might add, there's certain species where it's only hundreds of them, or dozens, like rhinos or whatnot. If you make a mistake with those, then there's done. And even if you make a mistake and you still have some left, and your compatriot might take over, there might not be enough genetic diversity within that herd to repopulate. And it's a lot more complicated than making money or not making money.
Yeah. This is not going to sound very economic, but there's, no, allocation of supply and demand and monetizing everything. There's such a thing as wanting there to be elephants. There's such a thing as wanting a beach you can walk on that's not polluted, that isn't monetized or controlled by that. So there is also such a thing as, I guess you could say, well, the rights of nature or the ecosystems, they're alive. And so we humans can value those things even if we never put monetary value on them.
I'd like to respond once again. Look, sometimes the market fails and we don't have elephants. But why do we have so few in the first place? Because of the system that I'm opposing. If we had my system all along, cows are not going extinct. There are millions of cows. AECO says there are too many, but they're not going extinct. If we had always had free enterprise for buffalo and look, at buffalo were almost going extinct. Alligators were almost going extinct because they weren't allowed to be owned. Then they were allowed to be owned, and now we're up to our armpits in alligators and buffalo. The same thing would apply to elephants and rhinos.
Ma'am in the striped sweater in the back.
To elaborate on that argument, you can take the wetlands, for example. If you privatize the wetlands and someone messes up, well, then it's not just that wetlands, millions of people lose their livelihoods. I would say that has an economic disaster written on it. And I don't know if there is an economic benefit to keeping wetlands healthy. You know, like, I think the only economic benefit for an individual who owns a piece of wetlands would be to allow the oil company to create a pipeline on it. So millions of people might lose their livelihood, but that one individual has an economic gain.
If everyone owned the wetlands and I allow pipes or whatever to come in and now we ruin your land, you sue me. And if we have courts that upheld private property rights, I wouldn't be allowed to do that in the first place.
Why would you own the wetlands then? What economic gain do you
Look,
get?
we're now neighbors. You own wetlands A, I own wetlands B. And what I do is I screw up wetlands B in such a way that it hurts wetlands A. Well, you sue me. Or you get an injunction even before I can do it, and you go to court and say, look, Walter is gonna screw up his wetlands, and it's gonna lead to a mudslide or whatever it is, a caving in of your wetlands, and you want the court to stop it. Well, look, take the case of, we're two farmers. And you own farm A and I own farm B. And I start doing something that has a mudslide onto your land. What are you gonna do? You're gonna go to court and stop me. Well, all I'm saying, and now we don't have that problem, or it's not a horrendous problem. We have a horrendous problem with the wetlands, as Craig was saying in this opening speech. He was saying that the whole thing is going to the dogs, or whatever the expression is. But why is it? Because it's not owned. If it was owned, if I own the aquifer and you're messing with it, I'll sue you.
But if you own it, how are you gonna get economic gain from it if you don't somewhat
Just to
destroy it?
interject, we
What I'll
have
do
time
is I'll
for
put
two
some,
more
I'll put
questions.
some trees there, I'll put some houses. Look, just look west of Kenner, west of the airport. There's just wetlands there. That land in Kenner is worth millions per acre, at least hundreds of thousands, maybe millions per acre. Well, all you have to do is put some sand in there, and now you've got more housing or more whatever.
So
The Chinese are doing it with those islands. I don't see why we couldn't do it.
I know we're getting carried, but let me just say, the very last thing I ended with in my 15 minutes was, who are the stakeholders? There are hundreds of thousands of people locally, but even more, that would say, we need those La Branch wetlands for their own sake. That's independent of Louisiana Land and Energy that owned hunks of that and about 20% of the wetlands in Louisiana.
Look, you people are saying the wetlands are in a crisis. And right now, the wetlands are unowned or they're government owned. So I'm offering an alternative solution. You say, well, that's no good. That doesn't make any sense. Try something different. You know, I used to play handball, and sometimes you hit the ceiling, sometimes you play a low game. If the low game isn't working, you go for a high game. If the high game isn't working, you go to the middle game. Well, what's going on right now with the wetlands isn't working. My colleague here says it's a disaster. So I offer an alternative and you say, oh no, that's no good. We gotta stick with what we got. We gotta stick with what's messing up the wetlands now. Well, what are the other alternatives? There are only three. There's government, there's non-ownership, and then there's private ownership.
Thank you.
Well, we've now got,
In the interest of time, we're gonna move on to the next question. So
Sorry.
Thank you. Next question, please, in the back.
So in a hypothetical system of complete private ownership, is there any place for intrinsic value? And that is to say that anything that doesn't find its value or have value in private ownership, is the elimination or destruction of that justifiable under that system?
could you give me an example?
So, or first I should ask, I guess, in a hypothetical system of complete private ownership, we're talking like all abiotic and biotic factors, like a global system, do you think that every life form would have some value to that system?
Well, you know, you biologists will correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that of all the species that ever lived, there are like 1% of the species that are still with us, namely most species have already gone. Now, it's possible that some species will go, but what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do is minimize the loss of species. And we're never gonna not lose any species.
But does a species have intrinsic value, or is its value only determined by private ownership? Or
It only has value if people value it. If people don't value it, then it has no value.
Then it serves no purpose.
I'm sorry?
So if you're saying if a species, for example, has no value in a system, it is justifiable to destroy it or turn the other way?
Most species would have value. See, we've been talking about cuddly species like cows and elephants, but there are worms and vermin and other kind of species like that most people see and they go yuck unless they're biologists. Well, who would have an incentive to save those? Biology departments at universities, pharmaceutical companies, because maybe the next wasp will be able to cure whatever the next disease comes up. So we as a human being, human race, will try to save these species because, you know, they might be useful to us.
Do you know how many species there are?
John, just stop. I'm going to give you both, and you both need to read this book. It's called Sustaining Life. Just listen, both of you, and I'm serious. How human health and existence depends upon biodiversity. All I would ask you to do, both of you, is to read the entire damn book and get a sense of there are thousands and thousands and thousands of species that anybody in this room, even me, have no idea of their value to us. And I'm not kidding you. There's no point in doing a debate like this until you understand the ecology of the systems. And there are folks out there that do, and therefore some little old wetland somewhere where you all would rather just mow it down has value in the context of life to us. Us. Not that whatever out there. Us. That book is the best thing I have found in 35 years of a synopsis of how human health and existence depends upon biodiversity. So I just want you to, if you're putting that there like he's the only one who needs to read it. You need to read it, both of you, to understand. Okay.
You're right, the title. In the interest of time, we have one more.
It's called Sustaining Life.
Question.
Can I make an announcement?
With that, of course, you may make that at the end. We're going to take one more question just to wrap up this debate. So, lastly, let's see, in the black shirt.
Oh, me. Okay. So, anthropogenic influence is pretty much what's causing the issues in the Gulf. Like you said, this leveeing and building of canals. You're suggesting that we privatize everything, which would allow private owners to still influence the land in a way that's beneficial to them, not what's beneficial to beyond what is in their borders. So how
privatize the land, not further cause damage to anything outside of what is privately owned.
Well, I thought I answered that with the young lady in the back with the striped shirt. Namely, I thought I did. I did my best. All I can do is my best. And what I said is that if somebody does something on their own property that hurts or negatively impacts other people's property, you get an injunction from the court and you stop it. And if you're too late to get the injunction, you sue them afterward. Look, if I have an atom bomb in my basement, what you do is you go to court and say, Block is a maniac, he's got an atom bomb in his basement, and the court will tell me to stop it. So if we harm each other and we violate each other's rights, we should be able to sue each other. Now, I gave the case with that young lady, I gave the case with this lady here with the pollution, and now I'll give it for a third time. If you do something to your own property that negatively impacts, that violates the rights of other people, you sue them. That's the American tradition, sue them.
But suing somebody isn't going to fix the land, that's just gonna get you money.
Well,
That's
it'll
not
stop
helping.
them, no, not only do you sue them, but you get an injunction. And the injunction is a letter from the court saying, you keep it up and I'm putting your rear end in jail.
But again, yeah, that doesn't fix the damage that you've done, that just creates more damage.
Look, we're on the wrong side of the garden, we're on the wrong side of the Garden of Eden for perfection. We're never gonna get perfection. All you do is you have a system, which is the best system. And the present system where the government won't allow you to sue for these things is a horrendous system. That's why we had all that pollution until the government had the Clean Air Act and stuff. But if they didn't do that in the first place, we wouldn't have had the problem. So I answer for the third time. Look, I realize that this is very difficult for you people. This is perhaps the first time we've ever heard a free market environmentalist, and it sounds alien. And I appreciate that. But I'm doing my best to try to explain this to you. And I'm going to read this book and I'll criticize it possibly. And I invite you, if you want more further information, that you email the two of us. We're each published authors. We've also written about this stuff. I've written about this pollution thing, the thing that I got here from that quote about it's not actionable. Well, if pollution is not actionable, of course we're going to have pollution. And if ruining someone's aquifers isn't actionable because no one owns it, well, of course we're going to have ruination of fracking. Fracking. Yeah. So that would be my comment.
Thank you, Dr. Block. Dr. Hood, any
Thanks.
concluding remarks?
No, thanks for coming.
Thanks,